I'm gonna try and say something coherent for once, and I hope I explain my process well, as I haven't done this in a while and have no idea what I'm doing. Buddy, the dawn has risen, and the first 10 pages of The House on the Hill are out everywhere. I'll be updating every Saturday with pages going up early on my website. Pages will still come out on Blue Sky, Tumblr, Tapas, and Webtoon on Saturday, but on Friday they'll be out on my website early. I recommend reading those first 10 pages before watching this video, as you'll see the pages, and that technically counts as spoilers, so just follow the link in the description to the pages. Today's video will be about the process of making these first pages and what actually making a comic looks like. Especially after not making a comic on a schedule in, oh my god, hasn't actually just been a full year? Prices aside, let's begin. First step when making a comic is the script. I won't go into too much detail, but I will mention that there are actually two scripts for this comic. There is the original script that I wrote about 2 years ago when I first decided to make this a comic, and there's the official script that I'm using now. It's mostly just dialogue and panel changes. I didn't even change any of the page counts. It's just that there's some differences because of refinement. The next step is the storyboarding, which again I'll save in detail for another video. I already had all the pages thumbnailed out for this because I had already done this before. I think I mentioned this in the last episode, but this isn't the first time I'm making this comic at all. Originally, The House on the Hill was going to run alongside Nine Lives for a season. I hadn't even gotten halfway through these very pages, but the crisis happened, and both projects were subsequently cancelled. However, I still want to make both projects. This project is also very small, being only 106 pages, so it's a great warm up to get back in the swing of making comics, especially on a schedule during college with a job. Ah! The actual storyboard situation is similar to the script. Most of what I do is reformat the picture of the thumbnails that I had taken traditionally onto a giant sheet so that I could have them all in one place. And then I altered some pages to match the new script. I do all my storyboarding and thumbnails for about everything that I do traditionally. I don't know why, but there's something about putting pen to paper that makes it a lot easier. It could also be that it forces me to look at the shapes and composition rather than the details, because I can't zoom in, and I do them quite small. And yes, I usually do thumbnails in pen. Again, I'll go deeper into this another time. To also see that I accounted for page numbers in a book. I knew when making the initial thumbnails that I wanted to have some 2-page spreads, which will require me having to keep track of where the pages are, so that, they don't get fucked up. Typically, pages in books start on the right side, so I also accounted for this in the format. I plan to do this for all my future projects. Once this was done, I formatted the actual pages, opening 10 documents and putting the thumbnails on the pages, resizing, adjusting, and of course, adding the panels. I always add the panels first before adding the sketch because the thumbnails sometimes need to be altered, and making the boundaries for the permanent version makes it a lot easier, such as expanding or shrinking panels depending on how I think the page will be formatted. Then I did the sketch. I'm very color-brained, so I did backgrounds in red, characters in blue, and bubbles/effects in purple. I then added shadows because I decided to do detailed hatching. I should mention that because this is the first page, I did a lot of experimenting with how I wanted them to look. I did the same thing with the Prince and Mermaid pilot, so some things in these pages and this process will be inconsistent. That's just kind of how it goes since I didn't really do any test pages for this comic. It's not that big, so I didn't really think it was necessary. I say this because after doing the text, I had to reformat the pages and redo the text. Basically, I made the pages too small for the text and then decided to resize the text with the transform tool. Don't do this. It didn't have any issues initially, but it took 5 centuries to load those pages back up, and I was not dealing with that. So I had to do all the text again. Why do the text now? Because I do everything traditionally, I don't have the space to add text in thumbnails to make sure the space that I allow for is actually enough or even too much. So adding text now allows me to shift around elements, especially characters, without having to worry about losing progress. For this one, I chose an all caps font with a lot of serifs instead of making my own. I might choose a different font later, but for now, this one is it. Once this was done, I did the backgrounds, and God, I loved doing the backgrounds. It was really easy to crack out, and the messy pen I decided to use for these backgrounds is really good for this. I mentioned I had done these pages before. I had initially done them traditionally with pens and watercolors. I didn't want to do them traditionally again since it was super hard, but I did want that look, so I picked a pen that had a pretty interesting way of acting and used that instead. It reminds me of a slightly dry fine liner with the way that it acts and is really good for hatching for that reason. It's also square, and I'm really into shapes right now, and I'm really into hard shapes and textures right now, so this was a great fit. The backgrounds were easy, they're mostly trees, hills, and simple shapes, with the house being the most complicated part. And even then, I'm not sure if I'm complicated with how complex it is. I kind of wish it was bigger, but I worked with what I had, and the giant windows and strange shapes still work for the narrative. Plus, there's definitely more in the back, and like 50 layers underground. I love drawing the pine trees the most, though. Oh, and this grass. The car was also fun. I mostly copied the design from the one that I sketched out in the concepts page with minimal changes. I then added all the hatching in the layer beneath it. It really helped add some weight to the drawing, especially since the pen that I used only has opacity pressure sensitivity and not size. Which makes sense. It's basically a fine liner. After this was done, it's character time. I mentioned the character style choices in inspo in the last video, but I'll talk a little bit about it here. I made all the kids extremely tiny compared to the adults, with tiny shapes compared to the large imposing ones. And Aunt Bella, in particular, has very big shapes. Because of the fact that I use such a simple style, especially the faces, I relied a lot on body language. Of course, this doesn't mean that I couldn't use their faces, but I use their body language a lot more than traditional expressions. This is another reason I think experimenting is a must for comic creators. Get out of your comfort zone, try something new. You might learn something or figure out that you like something. These pages are also all you get to see of the parents, as they leave and aren't in the rest of the comic. Say goodbye. Their mom is so pretty, though. I love drawing those curls. They were to die for. After that, it was colors time. And this is when I realized I didn't change my plan. Initially, I was just going to use flat colors for all the backgrounds and the characters, using the only shading as the hatching. But when I did this with the background of the first page, I hated it. The values just weren't deep enough, even with the hatching, and there was no real variety. So I went a bit crazy. To help get the watercolor look I was looking for, I used a paintbrush that is slightly transparent that allows me to mix colors or stack colors, as you'll see later. The background painting is probably my favorite part of making any of these pages. It's so much fun and cool, and I don't really get to do that often. I used a lot of blues and greens for the backgrounds, but in the future there'll be a lot of reds. So I get to have a ton of fun with color for this one. I'll definitely do a color theory and application video for this series later on. Then it was character colors. For these pages, actually picking the colors was pretty easy, especially since the lighting was very simple, and I didn't really have to alter very much during the setting. But I did put on a multiplier layer and added green shading for the background scenes and blue shading for the inside scenes. I regret this. It looks bad. This will not continue in other pages, I promise. But other than that, it was pretty simple. I did have to cover up all the background line art though, because as I said, the brush is pretty transparent. Fix this later by adding a base layer of a color before actually drawing in all of the colors. You'll also notice that while I'm doing all these colors, instead of using a paint bucket tool, I freehand all of them. Again, to get that more traditional look, I wanted it to be messy, really messy. So it was very important to me that I would hand draw most of the colors. Now it's almost over. It's bubble time! I had the bubbles slightly different for this one. I kept the messy vibe for them as well. Instead of the perfect or almost perfect shapes that I use for the normal bubbles, I used a scribbly circle instead. I also had to alter the tails for readability purposes. My other comics don't really have any readability problems, so the normal squiggly tail that I usually use was really easy for it. And when the background was too dark for it, I just altered the tail color. But instead, I sort of took the traditional comic tail, where the bubble is in the tail, and smashed it together with my squiggly tail. And this made it a lot easier to read, and I think it fits more in the scenario so that they look more cohesive throughout the entire comic instead of altering colors. And as usual, tails and bubbles alter depending on the emotions or volume of the speaking. Pretty typical, although that's not really here. Then the effects, which wasn't really much for this one. Action lines and such that I didn't really change initially, just black lines and written sound effects. But I do sort of add a gray buffer around them instead later on, especially ones where there's a lot of patching. These effects are the finishing touches of the comic, and I don't really get to add any cool effects, but there are still these little voids that I enjoyed. I hope this video was somewhat coherent, and I hope you read the comic yourself and maybe follow me on Tumblr and Blue Sky. I'll be updating Blue Sky and Tumblr whenever pages come out early on my website, and the next day you will get the actual page. I don't anticipate any gaps in posting since there aren't many pages, as I've already got a quite nice backlog anyway. But if something does come up, I will be updating on all 4 platforms. Anyway, I gotta get back to comic work. So stay tuned for the next episode. College is kicking my ass, and I kinda don't want to be here anymore. But, education. Woo!